Hey all. So back with another Spotlight with Context, and this time we are talking about Deathless She-Hulk. Really excited about this one. This is one of my babies. But before we get into it, I need to shout out my partner on this because I did work with somebody in our QA department for the entirety of this process. I was, the lead designer. My name was on the due dates, but they don't have a kabam name, so I'm not going to name names, but they helped brainstorm, the changes to the abilities, the SIG, did the first pass of the coding, and were basically just really important throughout the whole thing in making sure I got this out the door on time because I was also taking on a lot of other projects, and so just huge, huge shout out to them. Now, with that said, this is the last of the regular four Deathless before Thanos comes out. Really excited about her. I asked to be put on this character because I'm a big fan of OG She-Hulk, but I also know that she tends to not be used, even by me to some extent, because of how narrow her absolute best matchups are, how slow and unreliable she is to ramp outside those best matchups, and because of the stress of keeping things going. So, the core goal with Deathless She-Hulk for us was to try and keep her feeling like She-Hulk, but trade some of her truly extreme ceiling for a more reliable experience in shorter, mid-length, and non-target fights. And we'll talk about exactly what we change there as we go through. So starting off with the balancing attributes. Survivability of 3. She doesn't have any healing at all, but she does have basically 100% uptime on the inequity cap if you are running that. She has some immunities. She can deal with unblockable, which is also generally pretty good for keeping you alive. And so 3 is about right. No true healing, no exceptional damage mitigation, but basically constant access to the height of inequity and some minor immunities puts you in the middle of the road. Damage of 4. This damage attribute is definitely aimed more at like medium fights or even short fights where her damage is fine, right? Fine to good depending on what you are doing. And then the longer the fight gets, as with OG She-Hulk, she becomes exceptional. Like she is still a ramp up champion, right? Like that was part of her core identity. She's going to ramp a lot faster, and we'll talk about the particulars of that, but some of this 4 is definitely reflecting what she can do after, a minute has passed. Ease of use 3, like we talked about, one of the core goals of this character was making her easier to use and especially less painful to use, meaning that if you mess up and lose your ramp, it's not as drastic as it used to be. We'll get into that with more detail. Utility of 3.5. There's a lot of useful stuff in this kit. For the most part, we made lateral trades as far as what used to be in the kit as to what it is now. The SIG, I think, is overall better. In general, there's about the same amount of utility as the original kit here, except that I think it's a bit more relevant to exactly where MCOC is right now. We'll see if y'all agree as we go. And then defender strength of 1.5, there's almost nothing here. Like, she puts debuffs on you when struck. That's a threat in some places. If she hits you, it'll hurt. She'll do a little bit of burst damage through your block. There's, like, no threat. So getting into strengths and weaknesses. First up, she has a lot of physical damage. Instead of her old Furies, she now inflicts trauma debuffs, and that means that pretty much all of her damage scaling comes in the form of red numbers. Her red numbers are going to be significantly larger than her white and yellow numbers in most fights. She really does have more physical burst damage than almost any other champion in the entire game. Additionally, as I call out here, she benefits from negative physical resistance twice. If you're facing somebody like Ebony Maw, because of the way that trauma works, he will take extra damage from your actual landed hits, and then the trauma damage is calculated based on that landed hit, but it's also physical damage, so it is multiplied again by that negative physical resistance. So anyone who is weak to physical damage will be quite weak to Deathless She-Hulk. She has access to Fear on her heavy instead of the old Slow, which means that she can shut down unblockable abilities very, very easily. She also has anti-miss, because Fear is just anti-unblockable, where Slow is anti-unstoppable and evade. She-Hulk has traded in the evade part for just not being able to miss as long as her Fear is on the opponent, and that really does make her one of the best miss counters. Now, weaknesses. She is more vulnerable to debuff control now. There are a lot of ways in which the traumas are better, but they are debuffs on the opponent as opposed to passives on herself, and so she is more vulnerable to disruption. Going to be fully transparent about that. The same way that she capitalizes on negative physical resistance, if your opponent has a lot of physical resistance, it's going to sting. She has real trouble cutting through that, probably her primary weakness. And then tempo disruption, because she's still She-Hulk, right? She's still a tempo-based ramp champion. If your ramp falls off, it stinks. It stinks less than it used to. It is less likely to happen than it used to, but it still stinks. Now, getting into the actual abilities, start out with the familiar poison immunity, and here's the replacement of the Furies for the traumas, but let's talk about this for a minute. When striking the opponent or when struck, She-Hulk has a 40% chance to inflict a 14% trauma debuff for 12 seconds. So, on the original kit, this was an 11% chance to inflict a 35% Fury for 8 seconds. Now, she also got up to 50% extra duration on those Furies if the opponent was extra large, but a lot of opponents aren't extra large, right? So instead, what we decided to do was crank the base chance way up, cut the potency of the trauma from the Fury, under the assumption that you would generally have about twice as many of them, and then we just gave you that 12 seconds, the ceiling on the old Fury duration, against all opponents. There's more coming, but that's kind of the core trade here, is Furies get traded in for traumas that apply much more frequently and for longer, but they are individually weaker because of it. Now, for each personal trauma on the opponent, the chance to inflict additional ones is reduced by 2% flat. So you start at that 40%, and it does go down as you continue to apply traumas, but that's to a minimum of 10%, right? So you never drop below a 10% chance to inflict them on struck, and remember the original chance for Furies was 11%. So even when you have your 15 traumas on the opponent and you've dropped this all the way down to the minimum, you're ramping almost as much on your basic combos as OG She-Hulk was. And then there's this last bit here. The potency of those traumas is also increased by 1% for each trauma on the opponent, meaning that these get exponentially better. The more traumas you keep on your opponent, the more you are able to upkeep them and ramp her, the better that sum is. It's not just a linear progression. As you get more traumas, each one contributes more damage than the last. So she is actually at her ceiling, a lot closer to her traumas being an even trade for the Furies, as opposed to being the less than half that they are when they start. And so that's kind of what we were aiming for, right? You get the front end of the ramp much more quickly, but it's a bit weaker. As the fight goes on, the ramp slows back down, but each trauma that you get is that much better, right? I think this really smoothed her out in short and medium fights while still allowing her to ramp in long fights, and I'm looking forward to y'all's reaction to it as well. Lastly, we have She-Hulk doesn't share, so her trauma debuffs are paused during her strikers. This is a just completely additive change from OG She-Hulk, and it makes her work much, much better with relics. This is very nice in Necropolis. Next up, we have Inspire Fear. This is similar to the old panic mechanic on She-Hulk. This is the taunt, right? For each personal trauma on the opponent, she increases their chance to launch a special attack by 8%. The old number was 15%, but remember you are going to stack traumas much more quickly than you used to stack furies, so this works out pretty similarly, and it means that you have that special bias up a lot faster. For those of you who struggled with OG She-Hulk because it was like, oh yeah, sure, technically it's a taunt, but if I can't get the opponent to throw a special when I have 1 or 2 Furies, it doesn't matter how strong it is when I have 10, you'll probably enjoy this improvement because I do feel like it's noticeable much sooner with this change. And then again, when a non-skill opponent activates a special attack, She-Hulk refreshes all personal trauma debuffs on them, same as the refresh on the Furies for OG. Next up, we have the heavy attack. This is again familiar text. If the opponent is unblockable, then She-Hulk's heavy attack cannot be interrupted by basic attacks or by the final hit of special attacks. And if the attack lands, all unblockable effects are removed, and She-Hulk inflicts 2 personal trauma debuffs. So that's kind of a complex sentence. It does match the behavior of the original almost entirely, but that original behavior is kind of weird too, so let's dig into it. First off, your opponent does have to be unblockable. As long as they are unblockable and they're not in the middle of a special attack, that's what that's trying to tell you, then you can just throw the heavy and you won't react to the incoming impact. It's not unstoppable with a capital U, but it's very similar behavior. You cannot be interrupted in releasing this heavy attack. You will land it, and then you will remove their unblockable. You might get hit on the way if your timing isn't perfect, but this is a very powerful tool for removing nasty unblockables without needing to parry and get an opening that way, right? Plus, you automatically ramp, you get 2 more trauma debuffs, you keep the fight moving. Each hit against a non-skill opponent, each hit of this heavy attack, inflicts a non-stacking fear debuff for 12 seconds. This is again a little bit weird, but it's a little bit weird because we were trying to match the weird behavior of the original She-Hulk, right? OG She-Hulk can apply her slow on either the first or the second hit of her heavy, and depending on the matchup, both of those points are important. In some matchups, she needs to be able to apply it on the first one. In some matchups, she needs to be able to apply it on the second. And so we did keep that, right? The resulting debuff is still non-stacking, but you can apply it with either part of the heavy. And then while that fear is active, as a reminder, fear reduces the ability accuracy of unblockable effects by 100% and removes the ability to perfect block. On top of that, She-Hulk cannot miss while this fear is active. So you get anti-unblockable, you get anti-miss. Very relevant utility. Moving on to the special one, we have the same guaranteed ramp here. On activation, you inflict a personal trauma debuff. So no matter how many traumas you have on the opponent and how low your chance has become to get more by striking, you always get this one from the special one. And then each hit inflicts a Spectre debuff for 12 seconds. So this is, again, a lateral trade from the old Exhaustion. It's basically just aimed at heal reversal, right? Now, that might sound weird to some of you because it's only 2 15% debuffs, right? But honestly, I'm assuming you're running Despair with her. Because if you have even 1 point in Despair, let alone 3, the traumas that you're applying mean that you're going to be at the maximum basically all the time. It is absolutely trivial for her to max out Despair and have that minus 100% regen rate. And so then the first Spectre debuff is going to cancel out your opponent's recovery mastery, taking them to 0, and the second one will turn on heal reversal. If you can keep this special one up aggressively enough, you can even stack these up to 4, and you can get some serious heal reversal going. But one way or another, this is very good healing control. The special 2, I always felt was a bit of an oddball in the old kit. The Petrify was very strong, but it was quite short, and using the special 2 meant you were giving up the guaranteed ramp on the special 1. We've solved both of those here, right? So on activation, you inflict 2 personal trauma debuffs. So you're getting the same number of traumas per bar of power spent. The special 2 contributes to your ramp. And each hit inflicts a 55% wither debuff for 22 seconds, max dex 2. So you can't spam this and get a bunch of withers, but both of these together will allow you to reverse the opponent's power gain. You don't want more than this light reversal because you want them throwing specials to refresh your traumas, right? But this will control things. This will mean that Mystic Dispersion causes them to lose a little bit of power instead of gain it. It will slow down and slightly reverse Mangog, Dragon Man, etc. It is very helpful in those big Mystic target matchups. And you have 22 seconds of this debuff now. Used to be, the Petrify on OG She-Hulk is much, much shorter. This utility is going to feel a lot more usable. Then we have the Special 3. This has been reworked for the most part. It no longer has a stun. I didn't really feel that that was helping the kit. It does still have the weakness debuff for 12 seconds, which just makes her tankier. But the big thing that this does is that first it inflicts an indefinite 20% debilitate debuff. Only goes up to 2, but that means that your debuffs on the opponent, including your traumas, can last up to 40% longer, which is huge, right? That means that instead of your traumas lasting 12 seconds, they can last almost 17 seconds. Instead of your withers lasting for 22 seconds, they can last for, I don't know, what is that, 29-ish seconds? Like, this is a very large boost to how easy it is to upkeep her various effects. And it means that you're much less likely to lose your trauma ramp. If you are in a fight where it is basically just difficult to get the opponent to throw specials often enough, you're not being able to hold on to your traumas, then use the Special 3, inflict that debilitate, and you're just going to have an easier time of doing it for the rest of the fight. So that should open up her target matchups even further than the baseline expansion of that 8 to 12 second change. And then after the debilitate debuff happens, you re-inflict all of your personal traumas. This is not a refresh, this actually reapplies them from the beginning, and that's so all of them will benefit from that debilitate. So instantly all of your traumas just get 20% extra duration on them. This is very, very powerful for a long fight. We move on to the signature ability. Basically, all of this has been swapped out from the old one. It has the same spirit, right, in that she's studying her opponent, and therefore she gets a class-based benefit, but we have changed all of the class-based benefits. For science, when the opponent activates a special attack, you inflict an indefinite special concussion, same thing that Overseer has. This is just going to turn off a lot of the threats in science special attacks. This is particularly helpful against science champions that inflict debuffs during their special attacks. So Joe Fixit, Mr. Fantastic, etc. deals with them. Any other effects during the special will also have their ability accuracy reduced by up to 60%. So pretty powerful ability there. Against Mystics, while the opponent is below a bar of power, personal fear and trauma debuffs expire up to 50% more slowly, meaning that you have significantly more time against these opponents to push them to a bar of power and get them to bait out that special. This is only below 1 bar, it's important to note, and so if you're trying to push a Mystic opponent to a special 2, you could still potentially lose the traumas, But the idea here is that mystics have more ability power. If you are slowing down that ability power with your withers, this buys you a little bit extra time to push them over a special one so they can activate it and refresh all of your traumas. Makes her much easier to maintain. Against cosmics, her personal debuffs, so any debuff in her kit, including the withers and the specters, gains up to 10% increased duration per unique buff on the opponent, and this maxes out at 50% with 5 unique buffs. So against big buff-heavy cosmics, all of her stuff is just that much easier to maintain. Against techs, while She-Hulk is below a bar of power, she gets extra combat power rate, so it's harder for techs to keep you off that first bar. Helpful in some matchups. Against mutants, during their special attacks, she gains a pretty chunky bulwark so that you can just block those big mutant specials, right? All in all, like I said, I think she feels very similar to the OG. She is recognizably She-Hulk, but I think the play experience is much smoother and she can be used against a lot more champions. I hope you all agree. Looking at her synergies, she of course has one with OG She-Hulk. For both of them, punishing the opponent's special attack with a heavy pauses their personal effect, either the Furies for OG or the Traumas for Deathless, for 3 seconds. So if you can punish the opponent's special, specifically with a heavy, your maintenance is a lot easier. This is just updating you on what the actual effect from Vision's synergy with her is. This synergy doesn't live on She-Hulk. But for Deathless She-Hulk, having Vision on the team increases the ability accuracy of her personal trauma effects by 2% flat for each Deathless champion on the team. I want to note that this flat ability accuracy increase does some interesting things. First off, the way she's coded, it also increases the minimum chance for her traumas to apply. So if you have a team of all 5 Deathless, her chance to inflict a trauma when striking the opponent never drops below 20%. Very good for your ramp. The other thing it will do is that because flat ability accuracy modifications happen after others, this technically means she has a small chance to get around glancing. I would never rely on it, but if you're dealing with an opponent that has some kind of offensive ability accuracy reduction, that's going to happen before this increase. So you can have up to a 10% chance for her traumas to apply through glancing. Again, wouldn't rely on it, but want to call out that edge case. For Deathless Guillotine, these 2 champions reduce the opponent's critical resistance by 250 for each Deathless on the team, allowing Guillotine to land more of her degens because those rely on critical hits, and allowing She-Hulk to land more crits in general, which will then be amplified by her traumas. And then we have Deathless Arbiter with a coming soon that I hope y'all have all guessed by this point. Intercepting the opponent allows She-Hulk to inflict a personal trauma debuff once every 5 seconds. Lastly, we have one of the upgraded unique Deathless generic synergies here with Tiger, Invisible Woman, Medusa, and Valkyrie. For each unique synergy champion on the team, all champions, whether they're named in this synergy or not, gain extra critical damage rating and extra block proficiency. And then overall, I think it's pretty obvious. She's cracked with the Hulk relic. I already mentioned Despair. I mentioned Inequity. You should be running those masteries with her. She's incredible with them. But yeah, I think I've kind of said my piece on this one. I'm very curious to hear how y'all respond to this update to a character that I think has always been obscenely powerful, but a little bit out of the normal reach of most players. Does this make you want to try out She-Hulk? How do you feel about this update? Let me know in the comments. I look forward to reading them, and I'll catch you in the next one. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and take care.